He was supposed to walk through the terminal with that crooked grin, the one that always made the worst weeks feel repairable. He told his daughter he'd be back before the weekend, said he'd bring the candy she liked from the airport kiosk, the kind that sticks to your teeth and annoys dentists. He promised he'd call when he landed. Instead, a week later, a flight arrived with no one stepping through the gate. The only thing that came home was a sealed box and a silence so heavy it bent the air around it. By the time the funeral ended, a rumor was already breathing. It wasn't loud yet, but it was alive, quiet, insistent, impossible to ignore. Some people said he slipped. Others said the pool was shallow and the night was long. But then, 3 lines appeared in a leak that would shift everything off its axis. 3 texts, short enough to fit on a screen, sharp enough to cut through denial. It's happening. Don't let him leave. Handle it quietly. People claim those messages came from somewhere high, somewhere surrounded by glass and lawyers and doors that don't open unless you know the code. Others argued it was all noise, a cruel trick, a grief magnet designed to keep the pain from settling. But the thing about messages like that is simple. You can pretend you didn't see them, but you can't make them unread. When her phone buzzed that night, his mother wasn't expecting a stranger's voice to break the thin shell of calm she'd tried to glue around herself. The caller didn't ask questions. He didn't offer condolences. He just said there were files floating around in places they weren't supposed to be, and that she should sit down before she opened anything. She didn't sit. She stood in the kitchen, hand on the counter, staring at the glow of the screen as the documents loaded. 3 messages, timestamps, a contact name that didn't show a name at all, just an initial and a private number. She didn't breathe for 11 seconds. Then she breathed too much, too fast, like her lungs had panic instead of air. They told her it was an accident. They told her there were no signs of foul play. They told her there were no cameras. But here were the words that made the accident feel like a script. The next morning, she spoke without tears. Not because she was done crying, but because anger had built its own weather system inside her. She said her son knew the water. He wasn't careless. He wasn't reckless. He had a routine and a rule about late-night swims. It was always laps, always counted, always careful, headphones on but volume low because he hated missing the sound of his own breath when he turned for the next length. She said all of that, and then she held up a printout, and her hand shook, but her voice did not. If anyone was listening, they heard the floor shift. Before the leak, the story was simple enough to put on a single page. He traveled to a quiet place to finish something he'd started, a project he didn't name to many people, a cluster of documents and ideas he said would finally make sense of the last few years. He told a friend it was personal. He told his mother it was necessary. He told himself it was overdue. What he didn't say, at least not to anyone close enough to repeat it, was that he was nervous. Not stage fright nervous, not opening night nervous. The other kind. The kind that lives under your ribs and taps on your bones from the inside. He wasn't paranoid, he said. He was simply paying attention. There were whispers about what he was compiling. Some said it was a memoir with sharper edges than anyone expected. Others claimed it was a documentary in draft form, a set of interviews, transcripts, notes scribbled in the margins with names blacked out for now. A few said it was an exposé, but that word is a magnet for both believers and liars, so it's hard to know who was echoing who. What we do know, at least according to the leak, was that his project was nearing a point where silence would no longer be an option. That's when 3 messages found a screen they weren't meant to find, and a mother's grief turned into a lantern she refused to put down. The pool was small, cut like a blue pane into the center of a courtyard wrapped in white light. The kind of space meant for photographs and postcards, not secrets. There were no witnesses on record. No cameras, they said. The system had been down for maintenance, they said, and the technicians had not yet returned. Reports moved in waves. First a single line about a tragic drowning, then a longer paragraph that mentioned time of discovery. Then a third adjustment that shifted the timeline by a handful of hours and raised more questions than it answered. People posted screenshots, circled the changes, argued about metadata they didn't fully understand. Still, it wasn't just the edits that pulled attention. It was the quiet that followed. The less that was said, the louder it felt. Inside a hotel room where the curtains hadn't been fully closed, a silver device sat beneath a stack of folded shirts and a passport copy. It didn't look like much. No lock screen, no encryption, No clever hiding place beyond a hope that a drawer in a neat room wouldn't be opened by anyone who didn't belong there. But grief has a way of making mothers thorough. She searched everything. A small label on the device had a title that could have been a joke if it didn't feel so specific. If They Get Me. When she clicked the first folder, the machine didn't hesitate. There were emails, audio notes, a few draft chapters with more redaction than narrative. There was also a short video file named for her. She didn't know if she could watch it right then. She knew she had to. The screen showed a desk and the edge of a face until he adjusted the camera and settled. He didn't smile. He didn't perform. He breathed once, in, out, like he was trying to slow the room down, and then he spoke. He said he was tired of being careful. He said he had learned the cost of silence, and that it was higher than the cost of being hated. He said he loved, specifically, deeply, and that love was the reason he was recording anything at all. He asked forgiveness for what felt like cowardice, the leaving, the gaps, the not telling everything he knew right away. He said he wasn't brave, just out of time. He said if she was watching, it meant the worst thing had already happened. He didn't say who they were. He didn't need to. The message was not for the world. It was for one person, and it shook 1,000. When the audio notes were played, the voice was less steady. This wasn't a confession. It was a map. Names weren't spoken out loud. They were abbreviated or replaced with letters and numbers like a code designed to protect whoever still had something to lose. He talked about meetings that had taken place in rooms designed to look casual, like cafes that were too quiet, and offices with couches that swallowed people whole. He described a pattern: first flattery, then gifts, then warnings delivered with smiles, and finally the kind of pressure that steals sleep. He said he'd been asked to stop writing. He said he'd been asked to come back into the fold. He said the offer came with strings and a deadline and a clause he couldn't stomach. He said no. He said the air changed after that. Some of what followed came from a shadowed source, a voice that appeared on a podcast that's always 2 steps ahead of credibility and 2 steps away from it. The voice was altered. The story was specific. The speaker claimed to have been part of a team hired to observe the target's movements, to log every door key swipe, every phone call length, every email send time. Not to protect him, the voice said, to predict him. The voice described a message they received the night everything ended. Stand down, it's handled. The host asked who sent it. The voice didn't answer. The host asked if handled meant what everyone thought it meant. The silence was an answer with splinters. On the same day that clip crossed 1 million plays, several posts vanished from the accounts of people who had once been part of a tight circle. Photos came down. Captions were edited. Comments were turned off. Excellent publicists call that routine maintenance. Everyone else calls it a signal. A hashtag bloomed in the empty space those photos left behind. Someone painted a mural in a downtown alley, and by the end of the week, there were 5 more in cities that don't usually agree about anything. A girl who couldn't be older than 10 stood under one of them and held up a candle that dripped onto her fingers. She didn't flinch. Her mother tried to take the candle away. The girl whispered no. Both of them stared at the wings the artist had painted across his back. Not angelic, not soft, but forged metal with light cutting through the cracks. In the days that followed, a chorus grew from places that don't usually sing in tune. Activists posted threads. Editors wrote pieces that felt more like questions than articles. Old colleagues said everything they could without saying anything that might send a letter from a legal team. An unnamed source said a file existed. Another unnamed source said the file wasn't just a rumor. A third unnamed source said there were copies. That last part mattered. It meant that even if someone decided to burn the first page, the second and third would survive. The court didn't arrive immediately. Courts never do. There were petitions, hearings about hearings, motions with Latin names that sounded like spells designed to keep things quiet. But the quiet was cracking. When a judge finally allowed a small portion of the recovered material to be played, the room became a pressure chamber. He appeared again on the screen, this time in a different video, this time with papers pinned to the board behind him like a detective in a movie would do, except the pins were real and the consequences weren't scripted. He said he'd once admired someone he had come to fear. He said admiration is a dangerous thing in the wrong direction. He said he used to think loyalty was a virtue no matter where you put it, and then learned loyalty can be a leash if you're not careful about who's holding the other end. The video didn't name names. It didn't have to. It named behaviors. It named patterns. It named the way certain rooms felt when certain feet entered them. The sudden stillness, the way laughter changed shape, the way people adjusted their posture without knowing they were doing it. He said power is a sound before it's anything else. In the front row, his mother watched without moving. She wasn't waiting for vindication. She was waiting for truth to find its voice. An audio clip followed. It wasn't crystal clear. It wasn't a smoking gun in the Hollywood sense. It was a voice that carried a tone people recognize but rarely hear recorded. The tone of someone used to being obeyed. The words weren't explicit. They didn't say, do this or do that. They said, make it go away. They said, I don't want to hear about it again. They said, be smart. In a world where entire cases have flipped over less, those lines sat like a weight on the table. On sidewalks outside, strangers chanted the same phrase until their throats burned. Online, the noise surged and crashed and surged again, pulling in people who'd never heard his name when he was alive, but suddenly felt like they knew him. That's what happens when a story isn't just a story. It becomes a mirror. Depending on the angle, you either see your fear or your courage staring back. In the interim between the video and anything resembling a verdict, details emerged that hardened opinions and softened excuses. A staffer somewhere said they'd received an envelope to do a simple task unrelated to anything, except the timing was too sharp to be coincidence. Another person said they'd been offered money to talk someone they loved out of writing something that was already written in their bones. None of this was sworn at first. It floated as these things do, like ash in the air after a fire you pretended wasn't burning. But then, the pieces that could be sworn were sworn, and the ones that couldn't began to look less like smoke and more like a shape. His daughter didn't speak in public, not once. She stood beside her grandmother when asked, and otherwise stayed behind the umbrella of family like rain wasn't something she was ready to feel on her face. Someone said she carries a photo of the two of them on a ride with plastic planets and artificial stars, both of them laughing like gravity was optional. People said this because they needed to believe he laughed like that to the end. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. What matters is what the living need to hold on to. The memorials multiplied, murals grew taller. Someone projected his face on a wall that used to display ads for sneakers. A poet read a line about water that doesn't forgive, and the crowd went still like the words had dropped a degree in temperature as they left her mouth. A teacher brought a group of students and told them this was what happens when a story refuses to be buried. A man with a weathered jacket said nothing, stood for an hour, then left a single sunflower against the brick. Eventually, the legal machine coughed and moved. Subpoenas landed where they were aimed, lightly at first and then with more certainty. A witness hesitated, then spoke. Another stayed quiet, then changed their mind in the night and called a number they'd been told to delete. One person tried to fly out of town and was politely asked to stay. Another admitted to erasing footage they were told had already been backed up elsewhere. They said they didn't know why they did it, only that it felt safer than asking questions. Safety is a drug in rooms like that. It fogs the mind, slows the heart, makes the unthinkable feel like routine. Inside the courtroom, the mother wore black, not because television taught her that's what grieving women do, but because the color felt honest. She did not read a statement. She told a story. It started with a phone call and ended with a choice. In the middle was a boy who loved laps in a pool and jokes that only landed half the time, and blueberry pancakes he burned more often than not. She said he was not careless. She said he was not clumsy. She said he was not the kind of man who played with danger for sport. She said he was the kind who looked back over his shoulder to make sure the door had locked behind his family. The room listened like listening was an act of penance. Not every claim could be proven. Not every rumor deserved breath. The court had to slice with a careful knife. The judge warned that this was a hearing about evidence, not vengeance. The lawyers wore their caution like armor and their ambition like a scent. Still, the picture that took shape was hard to unsee. It wasn't a single thread. It was a tapestry. Messages that said too much by saying too little. Travel schedules that overlapped in ways that demanded spreadsheets. Bank transfers with labels that meant nothing until they meant everything. People who had known better and people who had known nothing at all. A verdict is a blunt instrument. It can't carry the weight of a mother's howl or a daughter's empty chair. It can only push a story across a line drawn in a book. When the decision arrived, the room didn't celebrate. It exhaled. Reporters tried to catch words in the air. but most of them fell to the floor. Outside, it rained the kind of rain that doesn't wash anything away but makes the dust lie down for a while. He was still gone. The questions were not. But the quiet that had once been a wall was now a door. In the days after, there were consequences that looked like signals sent to the future. A couple of networks adjusted their libraries. A streaming platform altered its carousel like it had never heard of certain titles. Public statements walked a tightrope, speaking loudly without saying anything that would spark a new blaze. A committee somewhere said it would look into structural issues, a phrase that means everything and nothing depending on whether the people in charge remember what it was like to be powerless. The project he had nearly finished did not die. It was completed by the people he trusted, the ones who understood which sentences were meant to be whispered and which were meant to be shouted. It was not a revenge piece, it was a record. A ledger of choices, a map of how pressure travels in a system designed to protect power at the expense of breath. It read like a letter to the living. In certain passages, you could hear him. In others, you could hear the people who loved him more than the idea of him. On the day that would have been his birthday, a crowd gathered in front of a building whose lobby had once been a second home. They pulled a canvas away from a bronze that looked less like a hero and more like a person stepping forward with a folder under his arm and a light behind his eyes that said, "Not today," to whatever tries to stop me. The daughter stood close, fingers woven into her grandmother's. The mother touched the base of the statue like it was a pulse and whispered something only she needed to hear. A breeze moved in and made nonsense of everyone's hair. Someone laughed through tears. A man from the city read a proclamation that sounded like a poem someone had to file at an office. Even after that, there were people who insisted it was all a storm in a teacup, a spectacle built on grief, a machine that eats tragedy and spits out virality. Maybe some of it was. The internet is an amplifier with no conscience, but not everything that spreads is hollow. Sometimes we pass around a story because it teaches us how to listen. Sometimes we repeat a name because it keeps the door cracked for the next person who will need to run through it. What about the messages? What about those 3 lines that started this all? It's tempting to let them become a legend, to let them turn into the kind of myth people whisper at parties to make the night feel dangerous. But if the truth matters, and here it does, the messages were pieces, not the whole. They were coordinates, not the map. They pointed to a larger shape. The way power deflects, the way fear disguises itself as caution, the way the word quiet can be a command that harms more than it heals. His mother never got used to microphones. She said the feedback made her jaw ache. But when she spoke at the final vigil, the one that felt less like an ending and more like a bridge, she didn't falter. She asked people to remember the ordinary things. The way he left notes in the fridge for the morning, the way he counted his laps out loud when he thought no one was listening, the way he hated missing calls from home and would leave meetings to make sure everything was okay over a scraped knee or a broken charger. She asked for less spectacle and more insistence. Don't just say his name. Say the names of the living who need help before they become hashtags. Don't just chant. Check on people. Don't just demand tapes. Demand protection for the next whistle that could save someone else's lungs from water. The crowd didn't cheer. It answered with a hum like a hive, a sound that says we are not done. Somewhere across town, someone who had once looked away looked back. A person who had once accepted the envelope let it sit unopened on a desk until the clock said too late. An assistant who had been told to be smart asked what smart actually meant, and why it always seems to mean the same thing. Shut up. None of these moments made headlines. They weren't built for trend lists. But they were the kinds of moments that shift the floor a millimeter at a time, until one day the whole building has moved and no one can quite say when it happened. Her granddaughter started leaving drawings on the refrigerator, flying machines and ocean waves and a small figure standing on a platform holding something up to the sky. In each one, the sky is different. Sometimes it's purple with streaks of white. Sometimes it's black with fireworks. Sometimes it's that gray-blue color that happens right before rain. In all of them, the figure has both feet planted like the ground won't dare move without permission. The mother keeps every drawing. She doesn't curate grief. She archives it. And the hard drive? Copies live where they need to live now, with people who know what it costs to keep light on. It's not a treasure, it's a responsibility. It doesn't belong on a shelf. It belongs wherever it can do the most quiet good, in the hands of those who can protect, verify, contextualize, and release when releasing is the only ethical choice left. In a different world, the folder would have been named something else. Maybe just notes, maybe summer, maybe work. But he named it If They Get Me, because he understood the game better than anyone wanted to admit. He wasn't asking for rescue. He was leaving directions for those who would have to walk the rest of the way without him. When people ask why this story matters, why any story like it matters, it's not enough to point at the mural or the bronze or the book with his name on the cover. Those are markers. They're helpful. They help memory stand up straight. But the heart of it lives in smaller places. A room where someone refuses to sign a paper that erases a question. A text that says I saw something and I can't unsee it. A late-night conversation where a person says, I think they'll come for me if I speak. And the other person says, then I'll stand beside you when you do. By the time the city returns to its rhythms, the lunchtime clatter, the early commute, the lights switching off in office towers with the same synchronized yawn, something has shifted underneath it all. Not a revolution, not a miracle. Just a refusal to let silence dictate the shape of the day. His story is not a weapon, it's a lantern. It burns with names we'll never hear and faces we'll never see, all the ones who chose to carry truth a little farther because a man they never met told them, quietly and without apology, that truth still has a pulse even after a body stops breathing. If a viewer has made it this far, if their chest feels tight and their throat is warm and their hands are a little unsteady, that's not an accident. That's not manipulation. The next time someone says be smart, ask what that means. The next time someone says handle it quietly, ask who benefits from the quiet. The next time a story arrives in a sealed box, ask who promised to walk through the gate with their arms wide open and why they never made it home. They tried to close the book. They stamped it and shelved it and told people not to check it out again. But pages have a way of loosening in the dark. He wrote what he could while he could. Then the rest of us picked up the pen, not to write vengeance, to write light. To write breath back into the spaces where power tried to paint over the truth. He didn't leave a legacy that fits neatly into a frame. He left a map and a warning and a love letter disguised as a file structure on a silver device in a drawer in a room where the curtains didn't close all the way. If they get me, he wrote, if they get me. They thought that meant the end. It didn't. It meant begin. And now the question doesn't belong to courts or networks or committees. It belongs to the people who watched and listened and felt that internal tap on the ribs, the one that says, this is your part. Not to shout for spectacle, to speak for substance, not to chase monsters, to protect the ones they would silence, not to turn grief into content, to turn content into care. They wanted quiet. They got a chorus. They wanted an accident. They got a lantern. They wanted a name to vanish. They got a sky full of drawings where the figure stands on a platform, holding something up to the light, both feet planted, unmovable, impossible to erase.